We can all agree that Superman is a fun movie. This video isn't about criticizing that element, and instead, I want to look closer at James Gunn's writing because I think his underlying script is flawed. I'll split this video into 6 chapters, all tackling a separate issue with his writing, and first, let's start with a pretty simple problem, and that's the movie's structure. The best way to illustrate this issue is to lay out the plot of the beginning of Act 1. Superman gets beaten by Ultraman/Lex Luthor, he's then taken to his fortress to heal. After getting stronger, he fights Ultraman again. He loses again. We see that Ultraman works for Lex, and then we go into Superman's personal life as Clark Kent at the Daily Planet, and that's followed by his interview with Lois Lane. Right away, looking at this broken down plot, there's a clear redundancy in plot points where Superman fights Ultraman twice. I also think the way these events are ordered doesn't feel very natural, and Lex Luthor suddenly pulling Ultraman out of the second fight exposes an inconsistency for Lex's motivation. The main revelation at the end of the movie is that Lex Luthor's entire plan wasn't necessarily about just gaining more power and territory, but to kill Superman.
I created the Baravian military conflict so I'd have an excuse to kill you.
This metahuman he's fighting is classified as the Hammer of Baravia, so Lex could easily kill Superman here without any pushback, especially after he already found his fortress. This is a separate issue that I'll elaborate on later when analyzing Lex Luthor, but the structure exposes that flaw as well. A simple solution here structurally that fixes all of this is to rearrange these plot points. Start the movie with Clark Kent going to the Daily Planet, which operates as a more natural beginning that builds his character first. A common thing people loved about this movie is that we skip the entire origin story, which I also like, but you need to still establish what this version of Superman/Clark Kent is like. Opening the movie with him as Superman delays that much needed characterization to make you care about his fight with Ultraman. After opening the movie with Clark Kent at the Daily Planet, we go into the Lois Lane scene, which sets up his relationship and the vast majority of his characteristics. In the original version, we don't get to this scene until 20 minutes into the film, thus delaying us learning what this character is like internally. This interview will still end with a lot of tension between Clark and Lois, but the way this scene should be punctuated is that it's interrupted by Ultraman attacking the city. So Superman has to save the day, and I also feel this touches on another problem of the conflict of balancing Superman and Clark Kent, something the movie doesn't really do at all. From here they fight, he gets defeated, and he goes to his fortress. From there, you continue on with the rest of the film with the second fight cut out, although we don't technically see the first one in the original cut. So just for the first half of Act 1, I think this removes redundancy, is a more natural order that better eases us into Clark's character, plus with the added benefit of using diegetic exposition while on the Daily Planet, and it also solves 2 outside issues in regards to Lex's inconsistent motivation and the conflict of balancing a superhero's life. This is me primarily looking at the first 20 minutes of the film, and obviously covering everything would be too time consuming. But to highlight another issue with the movie's structure is that Superman is basically MIA for the entire middle section of the movie. He turns himself in and is tucked away in Lex Luthor's pocket universe. Now, I feel like this element of the movie would be fine if it wasn't held together with 2 contrivances. The first one is that Lex is holding the baby of this metahuman who can replicate any element hostage, but when Superman is starting to escape his cell, and they clearly are devising an escape plan, like creating a son for a long period of time, nothing is done to the baby. This entire threat was supposedly holding back the metahuman, and it ends up being absolutely weightless, which I guess you could maybe argue Lex doesn't want to kill babies. However, he's set up as being extremely cold and brutal, so that wouldn't make sense. The second contrivance is Lex Luthor breaking the Geneva Conventions and holding Superman in a pocket universe, and the issue here is that, simultaneously, Lex doesn't want to kill Superman yet because the US government wants to ask him questions. I feel like Lex's drive of desperately wanting to kill Superman would override the minor obstacle of the government getting mad at him for doing so. It seems like he gets major catharsis out of torturing Superman, and that would be a justifiable reason to keep him alive. I'm just going off of his described reason for not killing him. So to loop back to the point of structure, since this section of Act 2 is held together with plot contrivances, it invalidates Superman's struggles because the conflict surrounding him is hollow. It doesn't feel substantive and leads to a bit of story pacing crisis. To be fair though, I think the time they fill in when Superman is absent is still good, as Mr. Terrific is a lovable character. It's just an interesting writing decision having your main character be inactive for a long portion of the movie. Going into the next overall issue that synergizes with the structure point is the general struggle between Superman and Clark Kent. This is probably the most pointed to criticism, and I think that's pretty warranted, because one of the biggest forms of conflict in the superhero genre is the balance of your everyday life and your superhero life. Spider-Man embodies this dichotomy the best, and if Spider-Man movies had the same ratio of superhero to normal life screen time as this movie, then Spider-Man would stay in a suit for 90% of the movie, thus taking away the deep humanity and emotion those movies have. Now, this may not be a big issue for some people as Superman is the main fun aspect, so Gunn wants to prioritize that element. However, I actually think the most compelling elements of Superman were the few Clark scenes. His battle with an identity crisis of his Kryptonian parents actually being evil and all of his beliefs being upended was outstanding. That's genuinely an aspect of the script I love, despite this being a negative video, because for Superman, you have to come up with creative ways to challenge him given his invulnerabilities. Cutting deep into the psyche is a great avenue to explore, while also being a segue into giving him a good character arc. Him coming to accept that his choices mold who he is, and not what his parents want him to be, is very empowering and heartwarming in execution, with it also punctuated with a blissful ending. I just wish this was an aspect that was built on more, because just after learning this, he turns himself in and the movie doesn't have a lot of time to linger on this subject. Then there's also the point of Clark Kent working at the Daily Planet, and I find it kind of funny that the movie opts to not try to have Superman maintain any kind of normal life. It's basically alluded to that everyone who works with Clark actually knows he's Superman, and if they somehow don't, then he'd probably get fired since he never shows up to work. The issue here is that having this tongue-in-cheek joke kind of subtracts another avenue of conflict for Clark that pressures his character. The superhero life is a time economy. Everything in the story is demanding his attention, but Gunn completely ignores Clark being in the Daily Planet. This also makes most of the characters there pretty paper thin and superficial, since the main character isn't present most of the time, so us actually being here isn't justified narratively. Like, apparently Jimmy is supposed to be Clark's best friend in the comics, and that was something that never occurred to me while watching the film. Gunn even opts to cast Beck Bennett, and it feels like he just copy and pasted him from SNL into this movie, as he just accepted that none of these characters have any depth, so some of them are just borderline caricatures. Giving at least a couple more scenes with Clark conversing with his work associates and, you know, his boss, is a pretty important element. Like, looping back to the structure point, the movie is juggling so many ingredients that it's kind of crazy to me that the movie is only an hour and 59 minutes, subtracting the long end credits. And for how much time is spent on action set pieces, I don't know why we can't include more characterization and personal time with Clark Kent. If anything, those scenes should be relatively cheaper to produce than the large kaiju fights, thus pushing the movie into the 2.5 hour range, and it kinda just feels like studios as of late are deathly afraid of making their movies that long.
Stop it, Patrick, you're scaring him!
But with how jam-packed these superhero movies are, I feel like a longer runtime is a necessity. Since we're mostly on the subject of Clark Kent, let's talk about his actual character, and I have two main issues in this category. For the first one, it seems like James Gunn is making this iteration of Superman very immature. This is a pretty nuanced trait in general, as balancing emotional outbursts and anger applies to most characters. And for Superman, I think James Gunn tips too far into immaturity that it made me view this rendition of him as being childish.
Yes, but you know that's very silly.
I do?
The Baravian government of all people is saying this? Come on.
This is on the record, Superman.
No.
Superman, did you consult with the president before entering Baravian airspace?
I wasn't representing anybody except for me.
You have to say off the record beforehand, not after.
Why are you being like this?
Hashtag super shit.
Super shit? Come on, Lois. You know that one specifically irritates
This
me.
is on the record, Clark.
As that compilation showed, it feels like Clark has a much lower mental age than his actual age, which is around 30 years old, as established in the opening title cards. Now, to be fair, Superman is naturally naive. He's the strongest entity on the planet, and this will lead him to be dismissive and disagree with people that clash with his ideals. He's not going to be correct all the time, despite being so strong, and having some emotional outbursts in that regard makes sense. But James Gunn, I think, overdoes this aspect, so much to the point that Clark becomes less appealing as a character. This is someone who, by this age, should be acting with more maturity, going against the pretext of how this character should act given his age and responsibility. The issue here, though, is probably more in the execution of Gunn's script and also pushing the actor more while directing him. The second problem with his character, which isn't as major, has to do with his internal drive at the start of Act 2. Particularly referring to him wanting to get Crypto back. Now, the rage Superman feels here is a good way to showcase Fury compromising self-composure, and that leading to him making actions that reflect poorly on his character. However, I don't feel like James Gunn thoroughly establishes a strong bond between Superman and Crypto. It's primarily just carried by the inherent aspect of animal cruelty, and everyone loves dogs. But if you're writing your story with the intention of having Crypto get kidnapped and he needs to be rescued, then it seems like common sense to create a good relationship between these two characters. Gunn opts to do the opposite, where Clark flat out is annoyed by Crypto. For this point, I'm not saying that it's unrealistic for Superman to be as angry as he is given his relationship with Crypto. It's just not as compelling as having a strong and lovable bond between these two entities. Like for John Wick as an example, the puppy personifies the remaining love of John Wick's recently deceased wife. It's single-handedly holding him back from the brink of breaking down, so when the dog dies, his character snaps. For Superman, Crypto obviously doesn't have to die, but Crypto can operate as a narrative device that embodies unrelenting cheerful joy and happiness, while Superman is submerged in a sea of hate. So when Lex Luthor suddenly steals that one aspect holding him back, this would lead to a much more emotionally cathartic break for his character, thus leading to a more explosive internal drive for Superman to risk his life to save Crypto. Instead though, the way it is currently doesn't really have this emotional depth. Like, I honestly thought that given this is a James Gunn movie, we'd have a Guardians of the Galaxy 2-esque opening where Superman plays with his dog in a fun title sequence, like playing Super Fetch or other heightened activities you normally do with your pet. This both leans into the fun and silly tone of the movie, while also setting up the relationship between Superman and Crypto. However, it seems like James Gunn primarily wants to use Crypto as a device to repeat a joke of him misbehaving. Not a major flaw, but just a questionable choice when it comes to writing this story. So these issues paired with a general lack of Clark Kent's screen time left a bit to be desired for his character, especially since those aspects showed the most promise for me. To contrast critiquing the main protagonist, let's pivot over to analyzing the villain of this story, Lex Luthor. I think it goes without saying that Lex Luthor isn't fully bad. There are great aspects surrounding his character, like the over-the-top actions where he imprisons past girlfriends, and the performance from Nicholas Hoult is incredible. He's delivering an unhinged amount of energy in every scene, and so much to the point that I feel it masks a rather shallow villain. His hatred for Superman is so deep and immense, but the main reason we have for why he hates Superman is that he's an alien. That's kind of it. There's also the notion that Lex is extremely envious towards Superman given his iconic status, but you'd assume this would also apply to other metahumans given their immense power and influence as well. So I'll mostly just stick to the alien point. This internal reason for why Lex hates Superman actually operates really well in the narrative, as it pairs with the revelation of his parents wanting him to conquer Earth. It allows the villain to synergize his hatred and spread it amongst the entire populace. That's good, you just still need a certain amount of depth and backstory outside of just hating aliens. You need the why he hates aliens, which gives that much needed understanding from which we know where Lex is coming from. which that generally stems from past trauma and allows the audience to either sympathize with the villain or at least comprehend his perspective, thus fleshing out his character. James Gunn seemingly opts to not go this route and chooses to keep the villain simple. Maybe because the movie is already pretty stuffed, but as I raised earlier, you can easily elongate the runtime to flesh things out. Another big problem with Lex Luthor is his plan and general motivation. I talked about this briefly in the beginning of the video in regards to his motivation being inconsistent throughout the film via his actions. Lex Luthor at multiple points can flat out kill Superman, but opts not to for artificial reasons. I already touched on the opening and prison examples, but to elaborate, this now makes Lex Luthor's entire villain plan extremely convoluted. He refers to his share of Jaranpur as being a bonus.
That was just a bonus.
And just wanted the US government to be on board with him killing Superman. The issue here though is, why does he need their approval? He could easily just kill Superman with the Hammer of Baravia and the blame would seemingly be on the dictator. Boom bosh bing, Superman is out of the equation and he still gets his share of Jaranpur. That's a much more simple plan than breaking into his fortress, which by the way is a plot hole in that Lex Luthor just found this place and he should have no idea that he'd need Superman's DNA to get in, but besides that, he finds the recording of the parents to ruin Superman's reputation and then takes him prisoner. That's significantly more convoluted than the former of killing him with the Hammer of Baravia. To me, making sure your characters are making realistic decisions from their perspective is what makes a story authentic. When characters are actively choosing to do things that work against their inherent interests though, that exposes the writer trying to mask flaws within their script. Before tackling an issue with the climax, I want to address the subplot, which is Jimmy gaining vital information from Eve to expose Lex Luthor's grand schemes. I've seen pretty much universal dislike towards this subplot, and I think that first stems from Jimmy's lack of characterization. I'm not very familiar with the comics where maybe there he's some kind of chick magnet, but it's just weird and off-putting how everyone is so obsessed with his character, despite us not really ever seeing why. Maybe that in of itself is a joke, but I prefer this character to be more developed. This devolves his subplot into Eve drooling all over him, thus making her character seem like a doofus, even though that's contradicted by her smart plan to include sensitive information in her selfies, which ultimately brings down Lex Luthor. At a fundamental baseline, I wish Gunn wouldn't write characters who are this dim-witted, as it seems degrading, but this kind of stems into the other issue of focusing on these minor characters isn't very productive. Like, do we actually need to see these scenes happen, or could Jimmy fill us in terms of what he's been doing while the main characters are present? The movie is already very crowded, and I'd much rather we spend our time elsewhere. Like, what scene would you rather want to watch? Jimmy crashing out at Eve and not wanting to spend the weekend with her, or Lois Lane having a heartwarming dialogue scene with Clark's parents? In the current cut, she only speaks 2 lines of dialogue with them, one of them just saying hi. To me, that's kind of crazy, and it's a massive missed opportunity to not explore the blissful side of Clark via the pristine viewpoint of his parents, which also would further endear her character in loving Clark even more. So to me, that's a crucial development that we should be spending time on instead of Jimmy and Eve's storyline, which honestly doesn't seem at all necessary given that Lex Luthor tore a fabric in space-time and almost destroyed the entire world, something that was well documented by Mr. Terrific. You'd think that would be plenty to get him arrested and thrown in jail. But I guess not. We for some reason need this revelation that he's working with Baravia to get Jaranpur. Jimmy's involvement in the story only reveals to us that Lex is getting Jaranpur, but that's revealed anyways to us via Lex's monologue in the last act, further communicating that this is just a redundancy that should have been cut. And acquiring this information also contains a major convenience of Jimmy coincidentally having this relationship in the first place. Unless if I'm missing a throwaway line somewhere in the movie of him intentionally targeting Eve to manipulate her into whistleblowing. In general, you can effectively cut out this subplot and the movie still operates the same. On top of not really containing much character development, as James Gunn opts to repeat a joke that I wasn't a fan of. For the final issue that is within the last act of the movie, I think James Gunn commits two major cop-outs. The first one has to do with the evacuation of Metropolis. The way James Gunn chronologically unfolds the story, the city initiates a mandatory evacuation like 20 minutes before the rift hits. That's borderline impossible, so I'll just give the movie the benefit of the doubt that Metropolis has been in evacuation for hours at least since Lex Luthor opened the rift at night, and this is happening in the morning. With that addressed, I hate to get all uber realism in a superhero setting, but civilian collateral damage is a major point of conflict that Superman has to worry about. This is even addressed during the fight scene with the kaiju where he's desperately trying to protect everyone, even down to squirrels. So James Gunn snapping his fingers and having everyone get out of the city in time simply shouldn't be possible. You can't really raise the stakes to this degree without having some kind of collateral damage. I know Man of Steel was dark and people don't necessarily want that, but holding heroes accountable is a major part of a working world that deals with superheroes. Like, the entire basis of Captain America Civil War is derived from the loss of civilian life throughout the major battles in past movies. It's an overlooked aspect from the perspective of a superhero, and given how much of a focus Gunn was putting on Superman meticulously saving everyone, it's weird how he opts to pretty much drop that in the end. Although, I do love this moment where he saves this person in the car, and this shot is simply euphoric. The issue is that you can't have it both ways. There's undoubtedly hundreds and thousands of people who are in danger that Superman can't save in time. Or I guess he could introduce him saving people, but then that makes the climactic fight even more distracted. Gunn in this regard opts to take the unrealistic approach of voiding this entire point of contention, and thus it is fundamentally a cop-out. Or you'd have to rework your story in which you aren't decimating the city with barely any time for anyone to react. Like, if James Gunn ever in the future wants Superman to break down over failing to save someone, then this plot point is going to be hanging over his head like an axe. The second cop-out in the climax is the Justice Gang getting involved in the Baravian and Jarampuran conflict. It was clearly established that the Justice Gang wanted nothing to do with this foreign diplomatic affair because they have to respond to the US government.
I took a vow not to get involved in politics.
Oh, that's part of the vows.
It's implied, yeah. But the risk is just not worth the beef between the US government and the Justice Gang.
Not our name makes us sound like cowboys, but I agree with the rest.
They seem pretty convinced on the subject, and everyone besides Mr. Terrific didn't even want to save Superman despite Lex Luthor breaking Geneva conventions. So the Justice Gang showing up because Superman asked them to seems like that shouldn't have worked. It directly goes against what was set up prior. The only thing that alludes to them changing their minds is through reaction shots of the Baravians preparing to attack. This situation seemingly upsets them, but why hasn't it before? They've been clear that they've wanted to stay away from this issue, so what's actually changed? The technical change here is that they know Superman is busy this time, so there's a definite outcome in which there will be major casualties. I feel this should be explored in a dialogue scene in which maybe Hawkgirl confronts Guy Gardner and convinces him to break protocol and be actual heroes. Which this also gives Hawkgirl some tangible development when she doesn't really have anything. Going back to how this is a cop-out is that it alleviates the entire pressure and consequence of Superman choosing to go to Metropolis over Jaranpur. Obviously, he has to go to Metropolis, but that established dilemma is completely invalidated with the Justice Gang changing their minds off-screen. James Gunn is seemingly using them as a deus ex machina to excite the audience with a surprising hero suddenly saving the day. And this comes at the expense of not properly fleshing out the motivations and decision-making of the Justice Gang. Overall, I think James Gunn needed to spend more time on his script. There's a lot of active elements in the story that need more time to breathe, and executing this movie in less than 2 hours led to a lot of problems. Along with Gunn compromising other elements in the writing, and making some decisions that I don't think were ultimately for the best. I'm down for having a fun movie, but that shouldn't come at the detriment of the movie's writing. Let me know in the comments what you think of Superman, and I'm sure it'll be a bloodbath since I'm stepping in front of the firing range because of how beloved this movie is. Thanks for watching, and my Letterboxd, Discord, and Patreon links are in the description. Thank you to the true hero of this video, Logan Farmer, my top patron.